Welcome to MentorTime. Recently, I've been adding more topics that are of interest to all of us potentially, but are things that aren't the usual career development, I'm seeking a job type of things. And this is a topic that's been on my mind for a long time. You'll hear me, I suffer from some of this and have for decades. Go ahead, put yourself off camera if you want. Here's what we're going to do today. What is good enough, in quotes? And then what are good enough decisions? We're going to talk about those. And finally, what should you do? Here's your takeaway. Good enough will get you farther than perfect will. This is me in 19. I don't have a picture of the event, but this is what I look like at the going away party that the research project I worked with in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, when we moved on and went to our next assignment in Belize. At the party, I was really pleased that someone from my research team made some remarks, and she had very nice things to say. But I remember how stunned I was when she said, and I thought I worked hard. I know everybody thinks I'm a hard worker, but I never knew what hard work was till I worked with Sue. And I thought to myself, oh, she does great work, but she also had a lot of demands on her time. But it stuck with me. And it took me a couple decades beyond that where I was still hearing or aware of those kinds of things. So let's talk about what is good enough. I'd like to do a Slido poll and have you tell me just briefly, and I'll do it too. These are anonymous. What does good enough at work mean to you? Have you thought about this? Is this something that you think about? That's great. Yes. Not holding up other people's work for one final check. Has little to no errors. Ready for the next level to comment, knowing that they will add a lot. Thanks. These are great. I really appreciate the participation that you all have put in, and also the ways in which we have some definitions of it. It turned out I began to see after that going away party and continued in my future, I am my own enemy. Good enough doesn't mean just doing an adequate job showing up every day. It means I can do a good product and get it out there and make sure it gets on to the next person who needs to use it. And that, for me, has been an area where I work hard. The reason we're doing this topic is we do too much when 80% might be the work needed. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. As I was looking at good enough, there was an article in the paper of several weeks ago which stimulated my thinking about it. I was looking for more information on whether people had dealt with the topic from the perspective I was looking at it, in terms of, are we able to modify what we do to do a good enough job and not have to keep agitating things like I do sometimes. The researcher, who you'll see on the next page, said that we adults make thousands of choices a day. The study was in the Washington Post, and I tried to think through yesterday, just a half day. I didn't come up with anywhere near hundreds, but I'm sure that there are things I'm doing that I don't know. This is the woman, Valerie Reyna, who does study this. And she said, we don't have enough capacity in our brains, and our brains are pretty great, as we all know, to make perfect decisions each time. Everything I looked up that wasn't just show up at your job and sit at your desk and then go home, kinds of good enough, it all came out to research on perfectionism. The good enough of saying the product that I've done is far enough along, the work that our team is doing is in the right place for us to pass it along. This was an article that talked about the 10 signs of perfectionist traits. And you may remember from previous times, here's what I'm going to do. Sue will, of course, recategorize the 10 results that are up there. The ones in green for me are the ones that push not towards the feeling to procrastinating, but the things that we can probably do things about that come out in why maybe we don't believe that our 80% is good enough. I'm pushing you a lot on interactivity today because I'm not an expert in this. We've all probably have tendencies towards it. I'd like you to just do a quick phrase or two. What situations make it hard for your decision making? If we're making these decisions and we don't have enough brain cells to be able to make every decision a perfect decision. The example, held up client reports until I did the final review because I didn't want funders to see products with errors in it. And yet there were very senior people on the team that were doing the work before me. I did that. I know I held things up. Any work situations where it's hard for your decision making that you agonize? Okay. Unclear what the director wants. That's a great one. Thank you. Being critical of others' efforts. Thanks, Sheila. Imperfect, but gets the job done. Great. Waiting to get all the feedback in order to move to the next steps. Yes, I'm sure that's very common for a lot of us. Perfect is a word that often comes up in conjunction with work characteristics. And although they don't use perfect in the job postings that you see, they want things that are the ideal. What I'd like to talk about is those 5 perfectionist traits that were in green, the ones that I identified when I recategorized them as things that I believe you can ameliorate. We'll talk about each one briefly. Having unrealistic standards. Anytime you want to share one that applies to you, I'm happy if you want to stick it in the chat box. I know this is hard for me. I know that's what the person in Bangladesh thought, that I had too high standards for what needed to be done. Fearing failure. The explanation on this from the list article is people worry about doing something imperfectly, so they don't want to do anything at all. They don't want to make a mistake. Focusing only on results. So people who are concerned with making sure you deliver at all costs. When a proposal's due, we have to deliver it. But when team members are trying to get work done and we're not working fast enough for our boss, that's one where we get into perfectionism. Being highly critical, I think someone wrote that, of being critical of others' efforts. And this is described as tunnel vision, but it's basically you're either in or you're out, all or nothing thinking. Either you do this thing and you do it the way someone wants, or you don't do it at all, rather than looking at the rest of the picture than the tunnel. I don't have any research other than Hogan assessment's one of several scales I looked at for how to measure perfectionism. Hogan wrote that we know that we need to correct what I started with. You can't do every task equally well or give it that much brain power, but we still try to do that. I would appreciate it now and put the 5 back up here. Can you tell me which is your top one? My number, the worst one that I have, is number 3, having unrealistic standards of what I and my team can get done. Thank you, Priyanka. 5, Hepzibah 2, appreciate you sharing. Thanks, Peter, Sheila, both 2s. Let's go on to what is a good enough decision. Herbert Simon, this is an article that talked about him, defined binary categories. You're either a maximizer or a satisficer. A maximizer basically researches things to death, is what I think about. I have someone in my family who can't do anything until she reads every review and then goes back over a scorecard. And this is basically reviewing every single option before taking a decision. Satisficers, on the other hand, the good enough decision is review information, move forward until you find the one that clearly is going to be help you go forward according to whatever decision criteria you are, and then move along. So, in other words, from this article, good enough decisions are thought out. They're not happenstance, they're not off the cuff. But if something clearly meets the needs of your situation, you decide it's good enough and call it a day. I asked ChatGPT for help on this. I wanted examples of what an employee or a team member would think for the name of this category. This one's all or nothing thinking. So this is the employee that believes unless a project is perfect, it's a total failure. And I'm not going to read every single story here, but if you're watching this in replay or you want to go back and think about examples that apply to you, Maria always felt that her work had to be flawless. The second one is being highly critical. So a manager constantly finding faults with the team's work, which is very demotivating. And Tom was known for his criticism. He's lucky he had a team left in this day and age. Having unrealistic standards. The manager sets unattainable goals, or the goals may be attainable, but has accelerated a timeline, which then makes it unattainable, causing team issues, stress, and burnout. I'm going to substitute Sarah. Sue sets high standards. I know that. Focusing only on results. So the sales manager ignores the process, ignores everything else that's going on to get the team to do the work, and focuses on driving achievements in the target. So probably every day, where are you on this? Where are you on this? You're behind. John focused on sales for that reason. And finally, fearing failure. So an employee is almost paralyzed, won't take on new work, won't have a way to grow in his or her career because of fear of making mistakes. And Emily, in this case, didn't want to lead a project because she thought she might fail. What should you do? I just want to remind you of the takeaway. Good enough will get you farther than perfect. I mentioned one of the scales, the Hogan, I think he calls it HDS scale. It was very long and complicated, so I found another one. There are several that are of interest, but this was a longer scale, and then they revised it to have 16 items, the big three perfectionism scale. And it was organized by the three areas: rigid perfectionism, self-critical perfectionism, and narcissistic perfectionism. I quickly made an Excel spreadsheet and made the columns all add up, because you get to choose from 1 to 5 where your comfort lies. And then I did a final total. The scoring for this is I didn't get the article that probably lays it out, and it didn't seem to be readily available. This was from a 2016 article when they described making the shorter version. But what I do know is what they say. Higher scores indicate more perfectionistic tendencies. The important thing about this is it's not binary, or it's not even if you're in the top 3, you're a really high functioning perfectionist, whatever. It just says be aware of where you think you fall on the scale, and then look at what you can do to ameliorate it, be aware of it, move on. So back to Hogan, they actually had some pretty good advice for moving on. I never thought about this, although I finally did learn better how to delegate before I retired, pretty well before I retired, but I was old when I was finally a good delegator. They put this second, and I should have reversed it. But this 80-20 rule, we hear it a lot about a lot of things, but basically this is the Pareto Principle that says 80% of our work results come from 20% of our effort. And while this originally was used to describe economics, what's important about it is not that only 20% of my work results in great things. It is the good enough principle. You do the rest of your work good enough to get it moved along. And the areas that really need your attention or where you're making big gains, such as innovation, come from a small dedicated portion of your time, 1/5 of your time. Staying calm under pressure, I think that's important. And certainly we have leaders still in around the world that have the luxury of getting verbally excited and angry even at people. I know that modern leadership, I hope you all are seeing better bosses than some of the ones I grew up with that were never calm under pressure and they took it out on their management team. And viewing work more positively. And I think they lost the opportunity by framing this positively to convey what they meant. What they meant is that work is never going to be perfect, and every day is not going to be perfect. Usually, your good enough effort, I'm phrasing it as good enough effort, is enough for what you need to be able to perform. And finally, this is you if you're managing a team or working even with collaborators, understanding perfectionists. And what I would say is the various ways these perfectionist traits come out is the key to managing. So I've made an assessment for you all to be able to find, if you want, reflect on what area you think you need help in and what you might want to do about it. I've got several references here as well, so that you can go on and decide how this can inform your life. Hopefully, you don't have to wait until I was in my fifth, sixth decades of work before I really grappled with how much I could be not doing good enough. And I'll just put out here one thing. I think we're going to be talking about it in a few weeks. This good enough is going to go hand in hand with what I'm focusing on in the last year and a half, which is not accountability, but getting it done. Many of us carry too many things on our mental and our physical to-do lists. And so I want to make sure that we're not suffering from not applying good enough and not getting things moved along. Most of these, there's a couple articles there. There's a lot of information on decision fatigue and on perfectionism. That's not all the articles that there are in the world, I can tell you. I wanted to give you a way for you to see how it might be affecting work and work production. So let me stop there and see if anybody wants to unmute or raise your hand and give me your thoughts on this today. Does it resonate with anybody? Oh, Priyanka, thank you. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I just wanted to say this could not come in at a better time for me. I struggle from perfectionism tremendously. And in my previous job, I had an ultra perfectionist boss. So I'm still working on letting go of the whole perfectionist thing. It's very difficult. And I don't think I've made like much progress. But yeah, some of these pointers are good for sure. Yeah, I'm just thinking of what actionable items can we do on a daily basis to just slowly or at least curb it a little bit, perfectionism.
I think if you think about the behavior change continuum, it's not you don't get aware of it and then you make this great change. We all know that. I told you it took me decades. For me, acknowledging that because when I was growing up in development, it wasn't talked about that there was a good enough way. It was always was the research well conducted? Is the data clean? Things like that, where there's a yes or no. There is no gray. I think if you can identify the areas where, for example, you don't need to insert yourself, or you can find a way to feel comfortable that your work gets passed on to the next person who uses it. And maybe they find an error. It's not going to be a huge one, but grammar or spelling, because I was surprised to read a few weeks ago that even when books are professionally proofread and printed, there's almost always an error that the author, the copy editor, the indexer, all those people didn't catch. Second, I would recommend, Priyanka, depending on what works for you, putting up little signs just to remind yourself, putting something in your diary, on your calendar, just to keep today's momentum and ideas moving along. I hope you'll take the test just to help you find out that it's not just this big ball of perfectionism, but, oh, I'm the person who, Sue, I'm the one who has the unrealistic standards. And from that, if you look at some of the references, and I'm happy to send on more if you need them, you will see advice for some of those areas specifically. I think it might have been the Hogan assessment that had more description of each of the things I've just summarized quickly. Does that help you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to see more of those references, and I'll definitely reference the assessment in the book.
Okay, I'll send whatever. When I send this out tomorrow, you'll get the reference links. And there were a couple others I looked at that I didn't put in here, mostly because they were redundant. But because each one of them had different ways of dealing with tendencies, I think it's always good to read a selection of them. And thank you so much for sharing that example.
Thank you.
And good luck to you. Keep me posted.
Will do.
Okay. Stephanie, did you have something?
No, thank you though for the presentation.
Great. Anybody else? I appreciate all your sharing and the things that you shared, telling me which ones you struggle with, because I want us to separate out reasons for doing things, not just I'm this or I'm that. Hepzibah, go ahead.
Yes, hi Sue. Okay,
Hi.
so I just wanted to know if you can give some steps or some things that you can do or practice to make you less critical. Because take me for instance, when I receive a document, I am immediately looking out for details, right? And I don't know, should that be the first thing you are looking out for in the first place, right? So if you could speak to that, I'd appreciate it.
I have the challenge of something similar. When I get things, my eye is immediately drawn to grammar and problems in a document, not to the content. And I blame my father because he raised us as very focused on grammar and making sure things looked presentable or were presentable. As with Priyanka, I will look through and suggest the couple things that may be helpful for you. But what I also think, Hepzibah, that is useful to do is try to focus. And again, this is easy for me to tell you, and you're going to have practice doing it. Try to focus on what is it this person needs from me, or what did this person give me that I need to do that is the reason it came to me, the specialist, the expert, whatever reason you're in the value chain of production. And what do I need to do with this before I move it on to my boss, or before I move it on to the funder, or whatever is the value chain you're in? Because we often get stuck on the easy things. The easy things are, oh, did they do the acknowledgments right? Oh, did they do the citations right? Rather than, how is this overall as a research report? Or how is this audit going to help people? Or what do I need to make sure my colleagues and my team know when I introduce this to them? Does that help you, Hepzibah? Think just short term about how to
Yes, it does.
refocus? Okay,
Yes, it
good.
does.
Great.
Thank you, Sue.
Thank you for sharing also. I appreciate it. Can feel very vulnerable to say, yes, Sue has very high standards, I know. All right. Any last comments?
Sue, I'll jump in for a second.
Oh, sure. Peter, go ahead, please.
So I got in a previous job, I got broken of being even trying to be perfectionist because of a boss that was particularly bad at communicating her vision on things. And so I would try really hard and put all this effort in. She would I would submit it to her, and then she would say, okay, let's have a meeting about it. And then we would schedule a meeting for 2 weeks later, and then her secretary would be asking, okay, give her, she needs the document to review. And I was like, she's had it for 3 or 4 weeks now. I thought she had reviewed it. So she looks at it 5 minutes before the meeting, and then we get into a meeting, and it goes off the rails minutes into the meeting about how it's not at all what she wanted. So I just started like putting the minimal effort in until that second round, and then she would actually tell us what she wanted.
Yeah.
So like that kind of broke me of maybe a little too much. And so I started putting really low amounts of effort in. But yeah, so sometimes it's just recognizing when to put the effort in. That first round wasn't it. It was the second round after people are actually putting in their thoughts and comments. That changed how I worked in that.
Thank you for that example. It's a great example of working with people. And sometimes it happens to all of us. Sometimes we don't know what we want till we get it. You get the general direction. I need a report for my boss to go blah, blah, blah. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh, how big a report, all that. You don't always have the opportunity to have someone read the first version and say, now do this and now do that. And I think that points out that the other person in the equation, Peter, also number one, didn't know what she needed, but also number two, didn't have time to deal with it if she'd had it for several weeks. It's another reminder that the way we operate and the standards we operate under that we've imposed on ourselves or grown up with, or whatever reason we've got them, aren't always shared by everybody we work with. And especially when you go into a new job or a promotion, those are areas, again, where you have to learn the culture and figure out what does this effort need. But both of those examples help us go back to one of the first things I reported on today, and that is that not all of our decisions can be taken with equal amount of measure, and we can't sit and ponder the state of the world every night and also make sure dinner gets on the table and other things. So I appreciate everybody sharing that. I'm going to quickly open up the chat box and see if anybody has any just general questions they need answered today. I'm happy to see you all. So I will close the meeting since Ron's not here today. Ron is traveling, otherwise he would be here. We love to have you come and help us help you and also help me. This was a good reminder for me of my standards about how things can help you in your professional development. As always, I appreciate all that you share and appreciate your willingness to put yourselves out there. So thanks for coming, and we'll see you the next time we're meeting.